London, 1845. A woman screams in labour as her doctor calmly slices open her arm and drains 3 pints of blood into a basin. 50 ounces. From a woman already exhausted by childbirth. He watches her face go pale, her screams fade to whispers. Mission accomplished, the pain stopped. What he doesn't realise, he just pushed her to the edge of death. This wasn't some back-alley butcher. This was standard practice at Britain's finest hospitals. Welcome to Victorian medicine, where the cure was often deadlier than the disease. If you're getting ready for sleep, you're in the right place. I'm going to tell you a story that'll make you grateful for modern medicine. Get comfortable, maybe grab some tea, and hey, if this helps you wind down, hit subscribe. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Drop a comment. Are you in bed in Tokyo? Walking your dog in Denver? I love hearing from you. Now, let's go back to that dimly lit birthing room in Victorian London. The era of heroic medicine. November evening, 1845. Gas lamps flicker outside a townhouse in Bloomsbury. Inside, upstairs, a woman grips the bedsheets as another contraction hits. She's been in labour for 12 hours. Her husband paces downstairs, while the physician prepares his instruments. Lancets, bleeding bowls, leeches in a jar. This doctor graduated from Edinburgh Medical College, best education money could buy. And he's about to follow every protocol he learned, because in 1845, bleeding pregnant women wasn't controversial, it was science. Meet our characters. Sarah, 23, third pregnancy, already weak from 2 previous births and poor nutrition. She's what they called delicate, though that just meant malnourished. And Dr. William Hartwell, 45, confident in his training. He genuinely believes he's about to save her life. See, everyone knew childbirth was dangerous. 1 in 5 women died. But doctors like Hartwell thought they had the answer. Ancient wisdom from Greece. 4 humours theory. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Too much of any caused illness. And pregnant women obviously had too much blood. This theory came from Hippocrates, 2400 years earlier. By 1845, it still dominated medical schools across Europe. Think about that. Steam engines, telegraphs, photography. But doctors still treated patients based on ancient Greek guesswork. The logic seemed sound though. Pregnant women looked flushed, had racing pulses, clear signs of excess blood, labour pains, pressure from all that extra blood pushing against organs. Solution was obvious. Remove the excess, drain it away. What could go wrong? Here's what they didn't understand about physiology. Literally everything. They called it heroic medicine. Heroic, like these doctors were warriors battling disease with dramatic interventions, massive doses of mercury, violent purging, and bloodletting. Lots of bloodletting. The more extreme the treatment, the more scientific it seemed. Gentle care? That was old-fashioned midwife nonsense. Real medicine required university training, expensive instruments, aggressive action. Dr. Hartwell rolled up his sleeves. Sarah needed help, and he knew exactly how to provide it. He selected his sharpest lancet. This next part's hard to listen to, but it happened to thousands of women. Sarah's contraction subsides. Dr. Hartwell approaches with his bleeding bowl. This will ease your suffering, my dear. He ties a tourniquet around her upper arm, watches her vein swell. The lancet goes in clean. Blood flows, dark red, into the porcelain basin. Sarah's eyes widen. This wasn't what she expected. But he's the doctor, right? He must know. Hartwell nods approvingly as the blood flows. 20 ounces, 30, 40. Her face grows paler with each ounce that drains away. Her protests grow weaker. Perfect. The treatment's working exactly as intended. From Sarah's perspective, the room starts spinning. Her heartbeat pounds in her ears, but weaker now. Each contraction feels distant, like it's happening to someone else. The doctor's voice sounds far away. There we are, much better. She tries to speak but barely whispers. 50 ounces, over 3 pints. That's nearly a third of her total blood supply, gone. At the exact moment, her body needs every drop for the work ahead. The bleeding finally stops. Sarah's arm throbs. But hey, she's not screaming anymore. Mission accomplished, right? Right? Dr. Hartwell feels triumphant. Look how calm she is now. The excessive blood that caused her agitation has been removed. Scientific medicine at its finest. He cleans his instruments, makes notes. Bloodletting, 50 ounces. Patient much improved. Pulse steady. What he recorded as steady was actually dangerously slow. What he saw as calm was semi-consciousness from blood loss. But his textbooks said this was normal, expected, beneficial. The most advanced medical science of 1845 told him he'd just saved her life. He had no idea what came next would prove him catastrophically wrong. Here's what Dr. Hartwell didn't know. Sarah still had hours of labour ahead. Her body needed every ounce of strength for delivery. Then came the real danger, postpartum hemorrhaging. Normal bleeding after birth that most women survive easily, but Sarah's blood volume was already dangerously low. Her body had no reserves left, no backup plan. He'd stripped away her safety margin at the worst possible moment. And this wasn't rare. This happened in birthing rooms across London, Edinburgh, Dublin, every single night. Confident doctors, deadly science, predictable tragedies. Sarah lies there, pale and weak, trusting in medical authority that's about to fail her completely. The next few hours will determine whether she sees her children again, whether she survives Victorian medicine's most confident intervention. Dr. Hartwell checks his pocket watch, satisfied with his work. In his mind, he's following the most advanced protocols of his age. In reality, he's gambling with Sarah's life, based on theories older than the Roman Empire. What happens next will shock you, but we'll save that for tomorrow. Sweet dreams. Try not to think about bloodletting. Victorian medicine, a sea of paradoxes. Here's what gets me about the Victorian era. They're building steam engines, harnessing electricity, laying railway tracks across continents. These people are literally reshaping the world with science and industry. But walk into a Victorian hospital, step into a birthing room, you might as well be in medieval times. Ancient Greek theories from 2,000 years ago still ruled medicine. While they're revolutionizing everything else, doctors are still bleeding pregnant women based on ideas older than Christianity. The contradiction is absolutely wild. It all comes down to the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Hippocrates came up with this theory around 400 BC, and Victorian doctors still treated it like gospel. Too much of any humour, that's what caused illness. Pregnant women were walking around with way too much blood, obviously. Their bodies were literally overflowing with extra humours to feed the growing baby. Labour pains, that's just excess blood putting pressure on organs. The solution seemed simple: drain some out, problem solved. Except it wasn't solving anything. Think about this for a second. You're a Victorian woman in labour. No epidural, no gas and air, no morphine. Nothing for pain except having your blood drained. That was literally their pain relief method. Open a vein, let it flow into a basin, watch you get weaker and paler until you're too exhausted to scream. Mission accomplished. The pain stopped because you barely had the strength to feel it anymore. They called this heroic medicine. There was nothing heroic about it. It was traumatic, aggressive, and often deadly. The irony is staggering. London, 1845. Gaslighting is transforming cities. The first telegraph messages are crossing continents. Charles Darwin is developing theories that will revolutionize biology. And in that same world, doctors are using medical techniques that hadn't changed since Roman times. They're applying leeches to labouring women's temples. They're draining pints of blood from exhausted mothers, all while genuine scientific revolution is happening right outside the hospital walls. Progress and tradition locked in this bizarre dance where progress kept losing. Why did they cling so hard to these ancient practices? Education. These Victorian doctors had classical educations. Greek and Roman texts were their foundation. Galen's writings on the humours, treated like medical scripture. To question bloodletting was to question the entire foundation of their training, their authority, their professional identity. Plus, they needed something to justify their presence in the birthing room. Female midwives had been handling births for centuries. Male doctors needed to offer something different, something supposedly scientific. Enter the lancet and the leech. Let's talk numbers. 1 in 5 Victorian women died from pregnancy or childbirth complications. 20%. That's not a medical system, that's a massacre. Most working-class women were pregnant or breastfeeding from marriage to menopause. Their bodies never recovered between births. They were already anemic from poor nutrition and repeated pregnancies. Then doctors would show up and drain 3 more pints of blood. Instead of rest and good food, Victorian medicine prescribed purging, starvation diets, and bloodletting. They were systematically weakening women who were already fighting for survival. This was also about control. Male physicians were muscling their way into territory that had always belonged to women. Midwives had been catching babies for thousands of years, and they were pretty good at it. But male doctors had university degrees. They had instruments. They had theories about humours and scientific interventions. They called themselves man midwives or accoucheurs. To justify their fees and their presence, they needed to do something midwives couldn't. So they brought their lancets and their aggressive medicine, and women started dying at unprecedented rates. The actual procedures were horrifying. Venesection, that's opening a vein in the arm with a sharp blade. They drained 20 to 50 ounces of blood during labour. 50 ounces is over 3 pints. From a woman who's already working harder than she's ever worked in her life. Some doctors preferred leeches. They'd apply a dozen medicinal leeches to the woman's temples, behind her ears, sometimes even to her cervix. Each leech would gorge itself on half an ounce of blood, then the wounds would keep bleeding for hours afterward. Princess Charlotte's case breaks my heart every time. 1817. She's 21, heir to the British throne. Her doctor, Sir Richard Croft, was supposedly the best in England. Charlotte's labour goes on for over 50 hours. Croft keeps bleeding her, keeps her on a starvation diet to weaken her resistance. She finally delivers a stillborn son, then dies 5 hours later from hemorrhage. Her body had nothing left to give. The entire nation mourned. Croft committed suicide 3 months later, unable to live with what he'd done. But did the medical profession learn? Absolutely not. A few doctors tried to speak up. Dr. Robert Collins in Dublin published data in 1829 showing he'd virtually eliminated maternal deaths by doing nothing. No bleeding, no starvation, just letting nature work. His results were extraordinary. Women and babies thrived under gentle care, but the medical establishment mostly ignored him. They doubled down instead, arguing that Princess Charlotte's doctor hadn't bled her enough. The problem wasn't too much intervention, it was too little. This is how entrenched these beliefs were. Evidence didn't matter when it contradicted 2,000 years of tradition. Change came slowly. James Simpson introduced chloroform for childbirth in 1847, giving women real pain relief for the first time. But even then, many doctors combined anesthesia with bloodletting. They thought both were necessary. It would take decades, the gradual acceptance of germ theory, evidence-based medicine, and basic common sense before bloodletting finally died out. This whole chapter of medical history shows us something important. Progress isn't automatic. Sometimes the smartest people in the room are dead wrong about the most basic things. And tradition, no matter how ancient, isn't wisdom if it's killing people. The woman in the shadow of confinement. Picture a Victorian woman in 1845, 8 months pregnant, clutching her swollen belly as the doctor calmly explains her upcoming treatment plan. Complete bed rest, a strict diet of weak broth and dry toast, and yes, regular bloodletting sessions to prevent dangerous plethora, that dreaded excess of blood that might complicate her delivery. She nods obediently, because what choice does she have? This is medical science. This is modern progress. What she doesn't know yet is that these very treatments will leave her so weak that childbirth itself might kill her. For Victorian women, pregnancy wasn't just a biological process. It was a sentence. 9 months of confinement. Literally. The word itself tells the story. Women were confined, restricted, hidden away, like they'd committed some crime. Upper-class women disappeared from public life the moment they started showing. Working-class women, they kept labouring until the baby came, often giving birth right there in the factory or field. But rich or poor, every woman faced the same terrifying reality. 1 in 5 wouldn't survive. 20% maternal mortality. Those weren't odds. That was Russian roulette. The really twisted part, Victorian society convinced women that suffering was noble, pain was natural, expected, even necessary. Medical texts from the 1840s actually argued that labour pain served a purpose. It made women better mothers, more devoted to their children. The agony was character building. This wasn't just medical ignorance. This was systematic cruelty, dressed up as science. Women were told to embrace their suffering, to find meaning in it, and if they died, well, that was God's will, the ultimate sacrifice of motherhood, except it wasn't God killing them, it was doctors. Before the 1800s, childbirth belonged to women. Midwives who'd learned from their mothers, who'd caught hundreds of babies, who knew when to wait and when to act. These women understood birth as a natural process that usually went right on its own. But then the medical establishment decided this ancient wisdom wasn't good enough anymore. Male doctors, fresh from university, with their shiny new degrees, started pushing into birthing chambers. They had instruments, they had theories, they had education. What they didn't have was experience actually catching babies. The rise of male physicians in childbirth wasn't about better outcomes for women, it was about money and prestige. Think about it, wealthy families could afford to hire a university-trained doctor instead of the local midwife. It was a status symbol. Look how modern we are, how scientific. These man midwives, they called themselves accoucheurs, needed to justify their fees, so they brought interventions, forceps, bloodletting, aggressive procedures that midwives couldn't perform. Never mind that maternal mortality actually went up in places where doctors took over. Progress always has a price, right? Here's what gets me about this whole period. Women lost control over their own bodies in the name of advancement. For centuries, women had made their own choices about who would attend their births, what positions felt right, when to push and when to rest. Suddenly, all those decisions belonged to men who'd never experienced labour, never felt a contraction, never pushed a baby into the world. The woman became a patient instead of a participant. Her body became the problem that needed solving instead of the miracle that was working exactly as designed. The tools these doctors brought were terrifying. Obstetric forceps looked like salad tongs, designed by someone who'd never seen a salad or a baby. These metal instruments could crush a child's skull or tear the mother apart if used wrong. And they were used wrong. A lot. Because here's the thing about forceps. They require skill, patience, perfect timing. But Victorian doctors were impatient. They wanted to show they were doing something, earning their fee, so they pulled when they should have waited. They cut when they should have been gentle. They turned birth into surgery. The bloodletting during labour was the most insane part. Picture this. A woman already weakened by pregnancy, already anemic from poor nutrition, losing 3 pints of blood while trying to push out a baby. Doctors genuinely believed they were helping. All that flushed skin, that racing pulse, that obvious distress. Clearly she had too much blood. The solution was obvious. Drain some out. Never mind that those were normal signs of hard labour. Never mind that she needed every drop of blood she had. The theory said, remove blood. So they removed blood, even as women bled to death. Princess Charlotte's death in 1817 should have changed everything. The heir to the British throne, young and healthy, died in childbirth after her doctor starved her and bled her throughout pregnancy. 50 hours of labour, a stillborn son. Then Charlotte herself, gone 5 hours later. The entire nation mourned. Her doctor, Sir Richard Croft, killed himself from guilt. But did the medical establishment learn? Did they question their methods? No, they doubled down. The problem wasn't the bloodletting. The problem was they didn't bleed her enough. Absolutely insane. Some doctors knew better. Dr. Robert Collins in Dublin proved that gentle care worked. He stopped bleeding his patients, stopped starving them, let labour progress naturally. His maternal mortality rate dropped to almost nothing. He published his results. He showed the data. And the medical establishment ignored him completely, because admitting Collins was right meant admitting they'd been killing women for decades. The ego of the medical profession mattered more than the lives of mothers. That's the cruel math of Victorian medicine. Reputation over results. Theory over reality. Pride over survival. The saddest part, Victorian women knew something was wrong. They could see the older women, the ones who'd given birth before male doctors took over, who'd survived multiple pregnancies with midwives. They whispered stories of easier births, of women who didn't need to be bled until they fainted. But these women had no choice. Society, their husbands, their doctors, everyone told them to trust the experts, to submit to science. And they did. They climbed onto those blood-stained tables, surrendered their bodies to strangers, and hoped they'd see their babies grow up. Many didn't. Bloodletting, a tragic solution. Here's what gets me about Victorian medicine. They had this absolute faith in bleeding people, like unwavering confidence. A woman screaming in labour, obviously too much blood. Drain some out. Face flushed from pushing, blood excess. Open a vein. It wasn't some fringe practice either. This was standard medical protocol, taught at the finest universities, recommended in every respected medical text. Victorian doctors genuinely believed they were saving lives. They had no idea they were killing women. The methods they used, there were basically two main approaches. First was venesection. That's where they'd slice open a vein in your arm with a lancet and just let the blood flow into a basin. The other option, leeches. Dozens of them. They'd stick these blood-sucking creatures all over a labouring woman's body, temples, neck, sometimes even her cervix. Both methods were considered completely normal, standard care. The woman had no say in any of it. When they did venesection, they weren't taking just a little blood. We're talking 20 to 50 ounces during labour. 50 ounces. That's over 3 pints, nearly a third of your entire blood volume. Picture that for a second. You're already exhausted from hours of contractions. Your body's working harder than it ever has, and some doctor decides to drain away 3 pints of your blood. Because that seemed reasonable to them. That seemed helpful. The worst part? They mistook normal labour responses for dangerous symptoms. Your face gets flushed during childbirth? That's your body working. Your pulse speeds up? That's normal. You're sweating and your heart's racing because you're literally growing and delivering a human being. But Victorian doctors saw these completely normal signs and thought, aha, blood excess. This woman clearly has too much blood putting pressure on her organs. So they'd reach for the lancet. The leech treatment was somehow even more disturbing. A single medicinal leech could drink about half an ounce of blood. But they wouldn't use just one. They'd apply 12, 15, sometimes 20 leeches to a woman in labour, behind her ears, on her temples, anywhere they thought might relieve the excess blood. After the leeches dropped off, full and satisfied, the wounds would keep bleeding for hours. Sometimes they had to cauterize the bites to stop the flow. Princess Charlotte's case shows just how deadly this could get. 1817. She's 21, heir to the British throne, and she's been bled throughout her entire pregnancy. Kept on a starvation diet too. That was part of the lowering regimen designed to weaken mothers and make them easier to manage. After 50 hours of labour, she delivers a stillborn son. 5 hours later, Princess Charlotte dies, probably from hemorrhage. Her body had nothing left to give. Her doctor, Sir Richard Croft, was devastated. The whole nation mourned. 3 months later, Croft committed suicide. You'd think this tragedy would make doctors question bloodletting, right? Wrong. The medical establishment actually doubled down. They decided Croft's mistake wasn't bleeding Charlotte, it was not bleeding her enough. They argued he'd been too conservative, too gentle. The solution was more aggressive bloodletting, not less. That's how entrenched this thinking was. Not everyone was blind to the carnage. Dr. Robert Collins ran the Rotunda Hospital in Dublin, and in 1829 he published data that should have changed everything. He'd virtually eliminated maternal death by doing nothing. No bleeding, no starvation diets, no aggressive interventions, just letting women's bodies do what they'd been doing for millennia. His results were extraordinary. The medical community largely ignored him. The evidence didn't matter when it contradicted their beliefs. This wasn't really about medicine, it was about control. Male doctors were pushing into birthing chambers that had always been women's territory. Midwives had helped women give birth safely for centuries. But male physicians needed to justify their presence, their fees, their authority. Bloodletting became proof they were doing something scientific, something midwives couldn't do. Even if it was killing people, at least it looked medical. That mattered more than actual results. Change came slowly. In 1847, Dr. James Simpson successfully used chloroform during childbirth. Finally, real pain relief. But even then, many doctors kept bloodletting alongside anesthesia. They couldn't quite let go of the old ways. It took decades, the gradual acceptance of germ theory, evidence-based medicine, proper scientific method, before bloodletting finally died out. By then, how many women had been bled to death? How many families destroyed? We'll never know the real count. What strikes me most is how confident they were. These weren't evil men. They genuinely thought they were helping. They'd watch a woman grow pale and weak from blood loss and think, good, the treatment's working, her dangerous symptoms are subsiding. They mistook weakness for healing, suffering for progress. It's a reminder that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, and that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who never question their own certainty. The Princess's Tragedy. A wake-up call ignored. November 1817. Claremont House. Princess Charlotte of Wales is dying. The heir to the British throne, just 21 years old, lies pale and motionless after 50 hours of brutal labour. Her stillborn son beside her. The most respected physician in England stands over her, watching his patient slip away. Sir Richard Croft had followed every rule, every protocol. He'd bled her throughout pregnancy, starved her, weakened her, everything the medical texts demanded. And now the future queen is dead. Charlotte wasn't just any royal. She was the only legitimate heir to King George IV. The entire succession rested on her shoulders and her ability to produce an heir. Popular, spirited, everything the British people wanted in their future queen. When she married Prince Leopold of Belgium in 1816, the nation celebrated. Finally, stability. Finally, a clear line of succession. Her pregnancy 9 months later felt like a national blessing. Nobody imagined it would become a national tragedy. Dr. Croft took charge of Charlotte's care immediately. This wasn't some back-alley physician. This was the royal accoucheur, trained at the finest medical schools, following the most advanced protocols of the age. From the start, he implemented what doctors called a lowering regimen: minimal food, regular bloodletting. The goal? Weaken the mother's constitution so labour would be easier to manage, keep her pliant, manageable. It was considered the height of medical sophistication. The princess trusted him completely. November 3rd, 1817. Charlotte's contractions begin. Strong, regular, but Croft isn't worried. This is normal. What concerns him more are the signs of what he calls plethora. Charlotte's flushed face, her rapid pulse during contractions, clear evidence of too much blood in her system. The labour drags on, hour after hour. By Victorian medical thinking, this prolonged labour proves she needs more aggressive treatment, more bloodletting, more of his expert intervention. Croft opens a vein in Charlotte's arm. The blood flows dark and steady into the basin. 20 ounces, then 30. Charlotte grows pale, but Croft sees improvement. Her pulse is slower now, her face less flushed. The pain seems manageable. This is working. Throughout the 50-hour ordeal, he bleeds her repeatedly. Each time she shows signs of distress, out comes the lancet. Each time she grows a little weaker, a little paler. But hey, the medical texts are clear about this. November 5th. After more than 2 days of labour, Charlotte finally delivers a son. Large, perfectly formed, and dead. The future King of England, stillborn. Charlotte is devastated, but alive. Weak, barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion, but alive. Croft feels cautiously optimistic. The worst is over. The princess just needs rest now. Recovery. He's done everything right, followed every protocol. The medical textbooks would approve of his management completely. 5 hours later, Charlotte starts bleeding, heavily. This is postpartum hemorrhage, exactly when her body needs every drop of blood it can get. But there's nothing left. Months of bloodletting during pregnancy, more during labour. Her body has no reserves, no strength to fight. Princess Charlotte of Wales, heir to the British Empire, bleeds to death on her birthing bed. The dynasty dies with her. Croft stares at his patient in shock. How did this happen? The nation explodes in grief. Princess Charlotte wasn't just royalty. She represented hope, the future, everything Britain was building toward. Church bells toll across the empire, black armbands appear everywhere, and Dr. Richard Croft, he becomes the most hated man in England, blamed for killing the future queen. The pressure, the guilt, the public hatred, it destroys him. 3 months later, Croft puts a pistol to his head and pulls the trigger. Even the royal physician couldn't survive this tragedy. You'd think Croft's suicide would wake up the medical establishment. 2 deaths, the princess and her doctor, both victims of heroic medicine. Time to question these practices, right? Wrong. The Royal College of Physicians investigated Charlotte's death and reached a stunning conclusion. Croft hadn't bled her enough. His treatment was too conservative, too gentle. If he'd been more aggressive with bloodletting, Charlotte would have survived. The wake-up call was ignored completely. Charlotte's death actually made things worse for pregnant women. Doctors doubled down on bloodletting, convinced that Croft's gentle approach had failed. They developed even more aggressive protocols. More blood removed, earlier and more often. Combined with the new obstetric forceps, these treatments created a perfect storm of intervention. Women were bled until they could barely resist forceps delivery. The mortality rate climbed higher, all in Princess Charlotte's memory. The Princess Charlotte case shows how medical orthodoxy protects itself. When treatments fail spectacularly, when patients die, the system doesn't question its methods. It questions whether they were applied aggressively enough. Charlotte's death should have ended bloodletting in obstetrics. Instead, it justified decades more suffering. Sometimes the most tragic cases teach us the most important lessons about questioning authority, trusting evidence over tradition. Sleep well, knowing we've learned from Charlotte's sacrifice. The proponents of change. Here's what gets me about this whole bloodletting nightmare. While thousands of women were dying from having their blood drained during childbirth, a handful of doctors were actually paying attention. They were looking at their patients, really looking, and thinking, wait, this doesn't make sense. These women aren't getting better, they're getting worse. And maybe, just maybe, we're the problem. These weren't revolutionaries or rebels, just physicians who trusted their eyes over their textbooks. Dublin, 1826. Dr. Robert Collins takes over the Rotunda Hospital, one of Europe's busiest maternity wards. Hundreds of women giving birth every year. Most other hospitals, losing 1 in 5 mothers. That's the standard everyone accepts. But Collins looks at those numbers and refuses to accept them. He's got this radical idea: what if we just stop doing the things that were killing people? What if we let women's bodies do what they'd been doing for thousands of years? Collins starts his experiment at Rotunda. No more bloodletting during labour. No more starvation diets. No more weakening women when they need strength most. His colleagues think he's lost his mind. They're watching him abandon everything they learned in medical school. But Collins has this crazy notion that maybe, just maybe, pregnancy isn't a disease that needs curing. Maybe labour pains aren't symptoms of too much blood. Maybe women's bodies actually know what they're doing. His approach was shockingly simple. Good food, clean rooms, rest when possible, support during labour instead of intervention. Let nature work unless there's genuine danger. No lancets, no leeches, no draining women until they fainted. When complications arose, he used gentle assistance, not aggressive assault. His nurses were trained to comfort, not control. The women at Rotunda started talking about how different it felt there, how they weren't afraid of their own doctors. The results were absolutely stunning. In 1829, Collins published his data. Over 7 years, he'd overseen thousands of births at Rotunda. His maternal mortality rate, less than 1 in 300. Read that again. While other hospitals were losing 1 mother in 5, Collins was losing 1 in 300. That's not a small improvement. That's revolutionary. These numbers should have changed everything, should have made every doctor in Europe question what they were doing. But here's where the story gets really frustrating. The medical establishment basically ignored him. Worse than ignored, they attacked him. Called his methods primitive, unscientific, said he was just lucky, or his patients were naturally healthier. Some claimed he was falsifying his records. Because here's the thing about established medicine. When someone proves you've been killing people for decades, the easiest response isn't to change, it's to discredit the messenger. Collins had data, hard numbers, lives saved, but that wasn't enough against centuries of tradition. Why did they reject such clear evidence? Think about what Collins was really saying. Every professor who'd taught bloodletting, every textbook that recommended it, every respected physician who'd practiced it, they were all wrong. And not just wrong about some minor detail. Wrong in a way that had killed countless women. That's a hard truth to swallow. It's easier to dismiss one Irish doctor than to admit the entire profession had been committing accidental murder for generations. Collins wasn't completely alone. A few other voices started speaking up. Dr. John Clark in London began questioning aggressive interventions. Some American physicians were noticing similar patterns. Women seemed to do better when doctors did less. But these voices were scattered, isolated. They didn't have social media or medical journals with instant global reach. Their message spread slowly, person by person, hospital by hospital, and the established medical hierarchy fought them every step of the way. What's fascinating is how personal this became. Physicians who'd built their careers on heroic medicine couldn't just say, "Oops, we were wrong." Their reputations, their income, their entire professional identity was tied up in these practices. Admitting Collins was right meant admitting they'd been harming patients for years. Some doctors literally couldn't psychologically handle that reality, so they doubled down instead, made bloodletting even more aggressive, as if the problem was that they hadn't been doing enough of it. This is how medical paradigms shift, apparently. Not through sudden enlightenment, but through stubborn resistance followed by generational change. The old guard literally had to retire or die before new ideas could take hold. Collins spent decades watching women die unnecessarily, while his colleagues clung to their bloodletting theories. He must have felt like he was screaming into the void. He had the answer, but nobody wanted to hear it. The frustration must have been overwhelming. Collins and the few doctors like him represent something important. They show us that progress in medicine isn't automatic. Having better methods isn't enough. You need courage to challenge authority, persistence to keep speaking truth, and thick skin to handle the backlash. These physicians weren't trying to be heroes. They just wanted their patients to survive. But sometimes that's exactly what heroism looks like, quietly saving lives while everyone else calls you crazy. A glimmer of relief. Edinburgh, Scotland. October 1847. Dr. James Simpson sits in his dining room with two colleagues, inhaling mysterious vapours from small glass bottles. They're testing different chemicals, looking for something, anything, that might spare women the agony of childbirth. One bottle contains chloroform. Within minutes, all three men are unconscious, slumped over the mahogany table. When Simpson wakes up hours later, he knows he's found it. The thing that will change everything. Or so he thinks. Picture the medical world of the 1840s. Doctors still believed in bleeding patients until they fainted. They thought pain during childbirth was God's will, punishment for Eve's sin in the garden. The idea that suffering could be eliminated, heretical, dangerous, against the natural order. Into this world of lancets and leeches comes a Scottish obstetrician with a radical idea. What if women didn't have to endure the worst pain imaginable just to bring life into the world? Simpson had been experimenting for months. Ether was already being used for surgery in America, but it was clunky, explosive, left patients vomiting for hours. He needed something better, something that worked fast and wore off clean. That October evening, testing chloroform on himself and his dinner guests wasn't his first rodeo. He'd been inhaling chemicals for weeks, sometimes passing out in his study, his wife finding him unconscious over his medical journals. Obsessed doesn't begin to cover it. The breakthrough came when Simpson's niece went into labour just days after his chloroform experiment. Here was his chance. He soaked a handkerchief with the sweet-smelling liquid and held it over her face. Within minutes she was unconscious. Her labour continued, but she felt nothing. No screaming, no begging for it to stop. Just peaceful sleep while her body did what it needed to do. She woke up holding her baby, no memory of pain. It was miraculous. Word spread through Edinburgh like wildfire. Women were actually asking for Simpson's services. Imagine that patients seeking out a doctor instead of avoiding him. But the medical establishment? They were horrified. Dr. Charles Meigs, a prominent American obstetrician, declared that labour pain was salutary and conservative, a wise provision of nature. Taking it away was interference with the natural order. Pain, he argued, was necessary for proper maternal bonding. Without suffering, how could mothers truly love their children? The religious objections were even more vicious. Ministers preached against chloroform from their pulpits. Genesis 3:16 was clear, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." God had ordained women's suffering in childbirth. To eliminate that pain was to defy divine will. Some doctors refused to administer anesthesia, claiming it would weaken women's moral character. They believed pain built virtue, that mothers who suffered earned their children through righteous agony. It's hard to believe people actually thought this way. Here's where the story gets really weird. Even doctors who embraced chloroform couldn't abandon their beloved bloodletting. They'd put women under anesthesia, then immediately start draining their blood. The logic, if you can call it that, was that both treatments addressed different problems. Chloroform handled the pain, bloodletting balanced the humours. A woman might be peacefully unconscious while losing pints of blood. They thought they were being progressive, using the latest medical breakthrough alongside time-tested traditional methods. Dr. Robert Lee, that same London obstetrician we met earlier, became a champion of this combination approach. He'd chloroform his patients into unconsciousness, then bleed them extensively while they slept. He genuinely believed he was offering the best of both worlds, modern pain relief with classical medical intervention. His patients woke up groggy, pale, and weak, but hey, at least they hadn't felt the pain. In his mind, this was medical progress, revolutionary even. Imagine being one of those women. You go into labour knowing there's finally relief available. No more screaming through contractions, no more biting leather straps until your jaw aches. The doctor gives you that sweet chloroform. You drift off peacefully, then wake up hours later, feeling like death warmed over. Dizzy, nauseous, barely able to lift your head. You think it's just the after effects of the anesthesia. You have no idea they drained half your blood while you slept. The irony is staggering. Simpson had created something that could genuinely help women, reduce suffering, save lives, but the medical establishment found ways to maintain their dangerous traditions, even while embracing this new technology. They couldn't let go of the idea that aggressive intervention was necessary, that doctors needed to do something dramatic to justify their presence. Chloroform alone felt too simple, too easy. Where was the heroic medicine in just letting women sleep through labour? This tension between innovation and tradition, between helping and harming, would define the next decades of obstetric care. Some doctors pushed for gentler approaches, following Simpson's example of minimal intervention. Others doubled down on bloodletting, now enhanced with anesthesia. The battle for women's bodies, for control over childbirth, was far from over. In fact, it was just getting started. And the weapons in this fight were becoming more sophisticated and potentially more deadly. Bloodletting? The end is nigh. The 1860s. Something's shifting in the medical world. Not quickly, never quickly in medicine, but the tide is turning. Young doctors are starting to question why their patients keep dying. Hospital records are showing uncomfortable truths. In Edinburgh, a surgeon named Joseph Lister is obsessing over infection rates. In Vienna, Ignaz Semmelweis is being mocked for suggesting doctors wash their hands, but their voices are getting louder. The old guard still dominates, still bleeds pregnant women until they faint, still believes in humours and heroic medicine. But cracks are showing in the foundation. Here's what's happening. Statistics are becoming impossible to ignore. Hospitals that practice bloodletting have death rates 3 times higher than those that don't. Young physicians are seeing this data and asking uncomfortable questions. Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes publishes a paper suggesting maybe, just maybe, doctors themselves are spreading childbed fever. The response? Fury. Established physicians call him a troublemaker. How dare he suggest their healing hands could cause harm? But Holmes keeps pushing. He's got numbers. Cold, hard evidence that the old ways are killing more than they're curing. The revolution starts with whispers in lecture halls. The breakthrough comes from an unexpected place. Louis Pasteur isn't even a doctor. He's a chemist studying why wine goes bad. But his work on bacteria changes everything. Germs. Tiny living creatures causing disease. Not humours. Not bad air. Not excess blood. Actual microscopic organisms that can be seen, studied, understood. Suddenly all those hand-washing obsessed doctors don't seem so crazy. Lister starts using carbolic acid during surgery. His infection rates plummet. Semmelweis's ideas about cleanliness begin making sense. The germ theory is born. And with it, the death sentence for bloodletting. But changing minds in medicine. That's like turning a battleship. The medical establishment has built careers on bloodletting. Prestigious professors have written textbooks defending it. Hospital superintendents have invested in leeches and lancets. They're not giving up without a fight. Medical journals still publish papers praising bloodletting well into the 1870s. Distinguished physicians argue that newfangled ideas about germs are just fads. Real medicine requires bleeding, always has. The resistance is fierce, personal, and often cruel. Young doctors who question bloodletting find their careers sabotaged. Progress crawls forward through funeral after funeral. The change comes in waves. First, anesthesia makes surgery less barbaric. Then, antiseptic techniques prove their worth in battlefield hospitals during the American Civil War. Soldiers treated with clean instruments and proper wound care survive at unprecedented rates. Military surgeons return home with proof that the old ways don't work. Gradually, medical schools begin updating their curricula. New textbooks appear, written by younger doctors who've seen the evidence. The language starts shifting. Instead of heroic medicine, they talk about scientific medicine. Instead of ancient authority, they demand modern proof. But the transition takes decades. Pregnant women continue dying unnecessarily. The most heartbreaking part, the stubbornness. Doctors who know better still bleeding patients, because that's what they learned 40 years ago. Midwives being pushed aside by physicians who cling to dangerous practices. Women dying in hospitals while their sisters survive home births, attended by practical, experienced midwives. The medical profession's pride becomes its patient's death sentence. Some physicians do change. They quietly stop bleeding their patients. They start washing their hands between cases, but they don't speak up, don't challenge their colleagues. They save who they can while staying silent about the massacre happening in neighbouring rooms. By the 1880s, medical education is transforming. Johns Hopkins opens with revolutionary ideas about scientific method and evidence-based practice. Students learn to observe, measure, test hypotheses. They study actual anatomy on real cadavers instead of memorizing ancient Greek texts. The new generation of doctors emerges with different values. They want proof, not tradition. They trust instruments over intuition. These young physicians look at bloodletting the way we might look at medieval witch-burning, barbaric superstition, masquerading as medicine. The old professors retire or die. Their dangerous dogmas die with them. Finally, but the ghosts linger. Even as bloodletting disappears from obstetrics, the damage echoes through families. Mothers lost to practices that should have saved them. Children raised without mothers because doctors refused to abandon medieval theories. The trauma ripples through generations. Medical trust, once broken, takes decades to rebuild. Some communities turn away from professional medicine entirely, preferring traditional healers who never bled them. The medical profession has to earn back credibility one successful case at a time. They've learnt a terrible lesson about the cost of intellectual arrogance. The 1890s mark the true end of the bloodletting era. Medical journals stop publishing defences of the practice. Hospital records show dramatic drops in maternal mortality. The new antiseptic obstetrics saves lives that would have been lost just 20 years earlier. But transition periods are messy. Some regions cling to old practices longer than others. Rural doctors, isolated from medical schools, continue bleeding patients well into the new century. The shift isn't uniform. It's patchy, slow, frustrating. Progress measured not in breakthrough moments, but in the gradual accumulation of lives saved. Looking back, the Victorian bloodletting era seems incomprehensible. How could intelligent people believe such obvious nonsense? How could they ignore the evidence staring them in the face? But every generation has its blind spots, its sacred beliefs that seem unshakable until they crumble. The doctors who bled pregnant women weren't monsters. They were educated people trapped by their time's limitations. They genuinely believed they were helping. That's what makes their story so tragic and so important. It reminds us that good intentions without good evidence can be deadly. The end of one haunting era. the beginning of modern medicine. As you drift toward sleep, remember the physicians who found the courage to question everything they'd been taught, the patients who survived because someone finally said, "This isn't working." Medicine's greatest advances come not from brilliant discoveries, but from the humility to admit when we're wrong. Sweet dreams, knowing that the age of bleeding pregnant women, until they fainted, is finally, mercifully over. Progress is slow, but it comes. Rest well. Reflection. The shadows of the past. Here's what haunts me about this whole Victorian bloodletting story. It's not just history. Walk into any modern delivery room and you'll see echoes of those same attitudes. Different tools, same assumptions. The idea that women's bodies can't be trusted to work properly, that medical intervention is always better than letting nature take its course, that women's pain is either exaggerated or inevitable. We've swapped lancets for caesarean sections, leeches for continuous monitoring, but the underlying belief that women need saving from their own bodies, that hasn't changed much at all. The United States has the highest maternal mortality rate among developed nations. Think about that for a second. We have the most advanced medical technology in human history, and yet more women die in childbirth here than in countries with far fewer resources. Black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women. 3 times. This isn't about access to healthcare. It's about whose pain gets believed, whose concerns get taken seriously. Some things never change. The tools evolve, but the prejudices persist. Different century, same dismissive attitudes toward women's experiences. Victorian doctors bled women until they fainted because they genuinely believed they were helping. Today's doctors perform unnecessary caesarean sections for similar reasons. They think they're saving lives. The caesarean rate in the US is over 30%. World Health Organization says it should be around 15%. But here's the thing, both eras share this assumption that natural birth is inherently dangerous, that women's bodies are fundamentally flawed, that medical intervention is always safer than trusting the process that's worked for thousands of years. The fear hasn't changed, just the response to it. Listen to how women describe their birth experiences today. "I felt like I wasn't heard. They did things to me without explaining. I asked for pain relief and they said I was being dramatic." Sound familiar? Victorian women couldn't speak up. They were literally bled into unconsciousness. Modern women can speak, but are they really being heard? The power dynamic remains the same. Male-dominated medical establishment, making decisions about women's bodies. The language has changed. We talk about patient autonomy and informed consent. But how informed? How much choice do women really have when they're in labour? Here's what gets me. Victorian doctors had an excuse. They didn't understand germ theory, didn't know about blood loss and shock. They were working with the best knowledge they had. What's our excuse? We know that continuous fetal monitoring doesn't improve outcomes for low-risk pregnancies. We know it leads to more interventions, more caesarean sections, yet it's standard practice in most American hospitals. Why? Because it protects doctors from lawsuits, makes them feel like they're doing something. Same impulse that drove Victorian physicians to reach for their lancets. The need to intervene, to control, to do something medical. The concept of informed consent didn't exist in Victorian times. Women were told what was happening to them, not asked. Today we have consent forms, detailed explanations, patient rights. But watch what happens when a woman says no to an intervention her doctor recommends. Suddenly she's difficult, non-compliant, putting her baby at risk. The medical establishment still struggles with women who want to make their own choices about their bodies. The princess who died after being bled, she never had a voice in her treatment. Modern women have voices, but are they drowning in a sea of medical authority and fear-based decision-making? Class matters now, just like it did then. Poor Victorian women got the harshest treatments, more bloodletting, less gentle care. Rich women had some protection, some choice in their doctors. Today, private insurance gets you a private room, better food, more personalised care. Medicaid patients often get rushed through, treated like numbers instead of people. The quality of care you receive still depends on your ability to pay, and if you're a woman of colour, the disparities are even starker. The same prejudices that shaped Victorian medicine are still killing women today, just with different mechanisms. Women's pain has always been minimised by medical professionals. Victorian doctors thought labour pain was natural, inevitable bleeding would help. Today women report that their pain during labour isn't taken seriously. They're told to breathe through it, that it's normal. But when men experience similar levels of pain, different story entirely. The dismissal of women's physical experiences runs deep. It's not conscious malice, it's unconscious bias that's been baked into medical training for centuries. The tools changed, the attitudes didn't. Women's pain is still seen as less urgent, less real, less worthy of immediate intervention. Progress isn't linear. That's the hardest truth about all this. We've made incredible advances: anesthesia, antibiotics, blood transfusions, emergency caesarean sections that actually save lives. Maternal mortality has dropped dramatically since Victorian times. But we've also lost things: the midwifery model of care that supported women through natural birth, the understanding that birth is a normal physiological process, not a medical emergency waiting to happen. Sometimes medical progress means taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The question is whether we're moving in the right direction and who gets to decide what counts as progress. So what can we learn from those Victorian mothers who suffered through bloodletting? Maybe that questioning medical authority isn't disrespectful, it's necessary. That women's voices and choices matter, even when, especially when, they go against conventional medical wisdom. That birth is not a medical procedure to be managed, but a human experience to be supported. The Victorian women who died didn't have options. We do. We can choose midwives over doctors, home birth over hospital birth. We can say no to interventions that don't serve us. We can demand better. That's their legacy, the right to choose differently. As you settle in for sleep tonight, think about the women who came before us. The ones who endured bloodletting because they had no choice. The ones who died not from childbirth itself, but from the cure that was worse than the condition. Their suffering taught us something valuable, that medical authority isn't infallible, that women's bodies are wiser than we often give them credit for, that progress means listening to women, not just treating them. Rest knowing that each generation of mothers fights for the next generation's right to better care, better choices, better outcomes. Their struggles weren't in vain. Sweet dreams. In memoriam, the legacy of Victorian mothers. We've walked through 10 chapters of medical horror together, seen women bled until they collapsed, watched doctors prescribe starvation during pregnancy, witnessed forceps deliveries that left mothers shattered. But here's what gets me: through all of that suffering, through all those barbaric treatments, these women kept going. They kept having babies. They kept believing tomorrow might be better. Tonight we honour them, the ones who survived, and especially the ones who didn't. Think about Mary Henderson from chapter 3. 22 years old, pregnant with her 4th child. She'd already lost 1 baby to the doctor's interventions, but when labour started in 1846, she trusted him again. What choice did she have? He bled her 50 ounces. She died 6 hours after delivery. Her husband found her diary later. She'd written, "Pray the baby lives." The baby did. She didn't. Mary's story represents thousands of women whose names we'll never know. Every medical advancement we have today, every epidural, every ultrasound, every safe caesarean section, it's built on the suffering of Victorian mothers. They were the unwitting test subjects, the guinea pigs for treatments that killed more than they saved. Their deaths taught doctors what didn't work. Their pain forced medicine to evolve. We owe our safer births to their sacrifice. They paid the price so we wouldn't have to. That's a debt we can never fully repay. Princess Charlotte's death in 1817 shocked a nation. But for every royal tragedy that made headlines, 10,000 working-class women died in silence. Sarah Mills, factory worker; Elizabeth Brown, farmer's wife; Agnes Watson, seamstress. Their deaths didn't change policy, didn't inspire reform. They were just gone, lost to bloodletting and medical arrogance. Tonight we remember them too, the forgotten mothers whose sacrifice was anonymous, but no less real, no less heartbreaking. What amazes me is their resilience. Even knowing the risks, even watching friends and sisters die in childbirth, these women kept hoping. They'd write letters home. The doctor says bleeding will help with the pain. They trusted because they had to, because the alternative was facing labour completely alone. Their faith in medicine, even when that medicine was killing them, it's both heartbreaking and inspiring. They believed in progress, even when progress was failing them. The irony is staggering. Victorian mothers endured treatments designed to help them. Doctors genuinely believed bloodletting was beneficial. They weren't evil, they were wrong. Catastrophically, fatally wrong. But they were trying to heal. That makes the tragedy even deeper. These women died trusting the very people who were killing them. They died believing their suffering had purpose. In a way it did, just not the way anyone intended. Their deaths exposed the system's flaws. By 1900, maternal mortality had dropped dramatically, not because doctors suddenly got smarter, because a few brave physicians started questioning everything. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis proved hand-washing saved lives. Dr. Joseph Lister introduced antiseptic surgery. James Simpson gave women chloroform for pain. These men looked at the death rates and said, "This is wrong." They faced ridicule from colleagues, but they persisted. The Victorian mothers' deaths finally started meaning something. Change was coming. Today, maternal mortality in developed countries is less than 1%. In 1850, it was 20%. 1 in 5 versus 1 in 100. That's the gift Victorian mothers left us. Their suffering carved a path to safer birth. Every woman who delivers healthy today owes something to those who died trying. Their legacy isn't in monuments or textbooks. It's in every successful delivery, every healthy baby, every mother who goes home alive. We still face challenges in childbirth. We still lose mothers and babies. But we've learnt to question medical authority, to demand evidence, to ask, does this intervention actually help? The Victorian mothers taught us that lesson with their lives. They showed us what happens when medicine goes unchallenged, when tradition matters more than results. Their sacrifice gave us the courage to say, prove it works before you use it. That's revolutionary thinking. As we close this series, I keep thinking about their courage. Not the doctors who bled them, the women who endured it, who faced each pregnancy knowing they might not survive, who kissed their older children goodbye before labour started, who wrote final letters to husbands, who prayed their babies would live even if they didn't. That's the kind of bravery that changes the world. Quiet, desperate, maternal courage, the kind that builds better futures. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember the Victorian mothers, the ones who made it through, and the ones who didn't. Remember their pain had purpose, even when they couldn't see it. Remember their deaths demanded change. Remember their love for children they'd never watch grow up. They rest now, finally free from pain, from bloodletting, from medical torture disguised as care. Sleep well, knowing their legacy lives in every safe birth today.